What I think is going to be absolutely critical is whoever they nominate to be the next commissioner. If that commissioner operates under those principles of leading with science, giving deference to agency experts, and procedural regularity, I'm very optimistic. But if we see more of a return to abnormal procedures and lack of deference to agency expertise, I'm worried.
Hello, and welcome to a very special episode of FDA Watch. As you know, we're the leading independent, nonpartisan podcast covering FDA in the U.S. I'm your host, Wayne Pines. Today is special because we're going to do a mid-year review. We're in the middle of 2026. This has been a most unusual, unprecedented year for FDA. We've seen the resignation under pressure of a commissioner. We've seen the development and implementation and announcement of several new programs and policies. We've seen controversy over things as fundamental to public health as vaccines. So we have a lot to talk about, and we're going to dive right in. I have two guests. They've been on the podcast before. Susan Mayne is an adjunct professor at the Yale School of Public Health from 2015 to 2023. She was a director of CFSAN, the FDA Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. And before joining FDA, she spent nearly 3 decades at the Yale School of Public Health, focusing on food and nutrition. Welcome back to FDA Watch, Susan. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you too, Wayne.
Paul Kim has been on before a few times. He's principal of Kendall Square Policy Strategies. Before founding Kendall Square, he spent 2 decades as a partner and co-chair of the FDA and government strategies practices at a major law firm. He previously served as health policy counsel to Senator Kennedy, not Secretary Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, Congressman Waxman, Henry Waxman, Senator Pryor, and he also worked at the FDA, AMFAR, CBGAGI, so he has a long experience in the FDA area. Paul is generally going to cover drugs and devices today, the first half year. Susan is going to cover foods and touch a little bit on cosmetics. There haven't been a whole lot of development in the cosmetics area, but I like to have a few sentences just bringing us up to date. So, Susan, let me start with you. Looking back over the first half year, what are the things that impress you the most about what's going on at the agency?
So some of the things that I would take stock of is what you mentioned at the beginning, is the major change in leadership at the FDA. As I'm sure your audience is aware, Commissioner Makary resigned in mid-May, and we are now have acting Commissioner Kyle Diamantis, who is leading the FDA. He is well known to the Foods Program, having served as the Deputy Commissioner for the Human Foods Program since early days in the administration. So that has produced some pretty notable changes. I would say part of Commissioner Makary's tenure was marked by a lot of procedural abnormalities, things like not using advisory committees, not pursuing typical rulemaking, not necessarily following the Administrative Procedures Act. And so that created a lot of chaos for all stakeholders at FDA who really are looking for predictability in its processes and procedures. I think with the pivot now to acting Commissioner Diamantis at this point, I think what we're seeing is more of a return to normalcy in terms of the procedures. Also, I think the staff are feeling a little more reassured by the normalcy that we're seeing coming out of the agency in the past 2 months with that change in leadership.
Do you have confidence in, Kyle Diamantis is not likely to be commissioner. That's what we hear. There's been a lot of pushback about the fact that he is, I don't want this to sound wrong, but only a lawyer. And there's concern about having just a lawyer as commissioner. But where do you see that headed in terms of what kind of commissioner do we need at the FDA? I'm going to ask Paul the same questions.
I think a former Commissioner Gottlieb wrote a really nice piece about what do we need in a future commissioner. And what he really spoke to is the importance of giving deference to the agency's career leaders, people with decades of experience, people who know how to do the work of the FDA. And so really, really acknowledging that, respecting that, and allowing those people to have voices. We know that was not always the case under the previous leadership. So really returning to a commissioner who's there to protect the employees of the FDA from political interference and allow them to do their work, get out of the drama and focus in on the work of the FDA, which we know is so incredibly important and that's also really vast. And so getting them focused on the work of the FDA.
Paul, same questions in the drug and devices area, medical products area. What impresses you about the first half of the year? And I also ask you to, build on what Susan said about what kind of new leadership we need.
There's no doubt that Susan's right about the most important development being this turnover in leadership. And I would just note that the change in leadership was so absolute and so comprehensive. We lost, multiple members of the senior leadership of the agency, as well as the commissioner. We lost two center directors right off. And, that kind of unprecedented change could have gone much more for the worse. I mean, we could have ended up, not just off the road, but literally in a ditch. And to Susan, your point exactly, I think that's not been the case. We've seen a constructive and positive change. A return to normalcy is something that I think many, many stakeholders have been looking for and hoping for. And we're seeing this slowly proof out as we see announcements made through the Federal Register, a slowing in the pace as we approach the midterm elections in November of, the splashy approach that Commissioner McCary had to, launching a new initiative a week. That's changed. And I think that's been a change for the better.
And again, I'm going to ask the same question to Susan. She gave, I think, a great answer, but let me ask you to see what do we need now? What do we need now at the head of the FDA? Or in the head of CDER or CBER or the Human Foods? What do we need?
Yeah, and starting from the bottom up, I mean, the fact that Mike Davis, who is a career FDAer, has spent time, as a review division head, has shown a willingness to pursue enforcement against those illegal compounded GLP-1s. I think those are a good, credible validation of what Susan you were saying, which is, reliance on the careers, listening to their expertise, not trying to change everything from the bottom up. The fact that Davis is still in place and has, I think, hopefully a good chance of remaining as, now our sixth CDER director in the past 18 months, an incomprehensible change. Hopefully that is a change for the better. Kareem McHale is, somebody who comes from industry, now head of CBER, and by all indications is nothing like Dr. Prasad. So that itself is a net plus. And as far as the commissioner, I have no doubt that acting Commissioner Diamantis is very competent and has a good reputation. I'm in that camp where it's important to have medical scientific professional at the head of the agency. And it sounds like a lot of the names being dropped, or at least sort of attempted to be trial ballooned, have been physicians. We've heard a number of names, all of whom appear to be, medical or scientific specialists. So I think that's a positive development as well, Wayne, that White House personnel, HHS are thinking about who's qualified to be commissioner.
So, Susan, I want to come back generally to the food area. In the first half of the year, what are the headlines? What happened in the food area that impressed you and that are really important?
Yeah, and the first thing I would start with is kind of the emphasis on chemical food safety. And that started early with the MAHA report, the commission report that highlighted problems with our food supply, certainly raised great concerns amongst consumers and others about food safety involving chemicals in foods. So that has been a big focus of the administration. But I think what's really happened over the last many months has been that there have been other administrative actions that have taken place that are really going against what the administration has stated as their priority about reducing chemicals in our environment and in the food supply. Not all of them are FDA, but what's happened is it's created kind of an uncomfortable juxtaposition between this focus on protecting consumers from chemicals at the same time that the administration is doing the opposite. So some key examples are things like the glyphosate litigation and the Supreme Court decision on glyphosate, with Secretary Kennedy stating that under the Defense Production Act, this is essential. At the same time, he's been criticizing the safety of glyphosate in foods.
That's Roundup, right?
Yeah, it is.
Right.
And, PFAS, we've heard a lot of concerns about PFAS. At the same time, we've seen EPA deregulating on PFAS in water. Most recently, FDA denied a petition to set levels for PFAS in certain food commodities. So a lot of the MAHA supporters are very unhappy about that. We have things like the synthetic dyes that consumers have been up in arms about. The timeline has now shifted considerably for a voluntary removal. It's now out to 2027, and many companies are still not interested in pursuing that. And the other one I would mention is talc testing for asbestos. This was relevant in the cosmetic space, where FDA was proposing that industry test talc for the presence of asbestos as a contaminant using established scientific methodologies. That proposal was withdrawn by the administration, suggesting that asbestos was not something they really cared about in cosmetics. So it's really that juxtaposition of the two that I have found most striking. And you're seeing headlines now about things like MAHA and MAGA are looking at a divorce because there's been so much concern about chemicals, while the actions of the administration are not making people feel any more comfortable about chemical safety.
So knowing the staff as you do in the Human Foods Program, given the fact that so many people left, whether voluntarily or not, do we have the staff that we need in order to protect the public, or what needs to be done on a staffing level?
Well, I think that's going to be critically related to something we're going to talk about, is the GRAS final rule, the proposed rule on GRAS. Let's start over there. I think that's something we're going to be talking about because of the proposed rule on GRAS, and that could potentially create an enormously large new workload for FDA. So even if they had not lost employees, FDA would be underwater. And so I think it's very, very important as we talk about the GRAS rule is, what is that going to ask FDA to do, and will they have the resources? Are there mechanisms contemplated to bring new resources in to take on a huge scope of work that the agency is currently not prepared to do?
Yeah. And just to clarify, I just wanted you to explain in one or two sentences what the GRAS rule issue is for those people who are listening who might not know what that is.
Yeah, it's general recognition of safety, and it's under the food additives area. And basically, industry has had the ability for several years to self-affirm that ingredients that they are adding into foods are generally recognized as safe. Has not been any mandatory notification to FDA of self-affirmed GRAS status. But the administration has claimed that they are going to close the GRAS loophole. And in fact, Secretary Kennedy said he already closed the GRAS loophole, which is incorrect. But they have claimed that they want to close this loophole with mandatory notification to FDA and FDA review of all the ingredients that are in the U.S. food supply. So we know, and we'll discuss this, that a proposed rule was submitted to OMB last year in December. The current unified agenda shows it coming out a year later, late this December after the midterms. And it'll be very interesting. We'll talk about what might be in that rule. Very interesting to see what happens on that front.
But if the rule is issued in final form, it would require more people at the Human Foods Program in order to evaluate the chemicals that are in our food supply. That's the bottom line, right?
That's the bottom line. But as you know, Wayne, from being at FDA, the devil's in the details. So if they were to somehow grandfather in or streamline in all the existing chemicals in the food supply, that would be a very different mandate than saying everything. Everything has to be relooked at, that folks have to present their safety assessments to the FDA, and FDA would be obligated to look at those to assure consumers that these ingredients are safe.
Right. Paul, I want to get back to you. We're going to shift gears, go to drugs and devices. again, in the first half of the year, the headlines in the drug area and then in the devices area?
I would say the drug side, I would call out three things: good, bad, and indifferent. I'll start with the good, which was the plausible mechanism framework, the evidence framework, which really is intended to get to very rare or N of one diseases and really codify in sub-regulatory policy what kinds of flexibilities sponsors and developers and investigators, academic investigators, clinical investigators can expect.
I'm going to ask you for one sentence on what that means.
Sure.
Anytime we use jargon here, we have a broad audience.
Yeah.
And I just want to, have it explained.
Well, plausible mechanism is shorthand for a set of criteria the agency's laid out to identify those diseases for which the agency thinks we can take an evidence base, which is very, very small in terms of absolute number of patients, and then be able to rely on that to actually come to a conclusion that there's sufficient evidence of effectiveness. So essentially, taking these unapproved new drugs for populations that you can put on one hand or two hands. That is something that they've done in the past, Wayne. Obviously, as you know, we have gotten drugs approved on very, very small patient numbers. But they're trying to create this as a really normalized framework. They initially proposed it as a pathway, which is very confusing to everybody because there are only so many pathways under the sun, and there was no need to create a new one. So they've talked about this now as an evidence framework in the context of both centers working under consistent standards to obtain flexibilities in what they can ask these investigators and these sponsors to demonstrate when you only have very, very few patients. So the criteria, you have to have a plausible mechanism that defines how the disease affects patients clinically. It asks for demonstrated clinical effect by the investigational drug. So there are these reasonably high hurdles. Actually, you're not going to see a million disease states qualify in a sense for this approach. But it was good that the agency actually took the next step. And I will say that they owe an intellectual debt, I think, to folks like Peter Marks and Janet Woodcock, who had published years earlier about this as this was becoming increasingly feasible. And then with Baby KJ, I think this is actually something that we may see congressional action even in to try to codify or at least put this into black and white.
So you had two other headlines.
Yeah, that was the good. Yeah. The bad, I would say, is the CNPV, the Commissioner's National Priority Voucher, which, I have harped on repeatedly as being actually detached from the statutory, the legal authority of the agency, to award expedited reviews to sponsors on the basis of most favored nation pricing. You can word search the Federal Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act and the Public Health Service Act. You will not find any such authority. And reshoring, again, a great policy objective, but to tie that to basically a completely opaque awarding system where the commissioner and a couple of best buds in the leadership decide who gets what. It's like handing out candy to your political allies. That is not a good way to promote biomedical innovation. So I would say the CNPV is a false start. Congress may get involved. They may actually give a good foundation in statute to something like that. But Wayne, the way we've seen this is not the way we should run the railway. So that's bad. I think I owe you indifferent, and I'm sorry if I'm going on, but the indifferent I would say would probably be the single trial plus confirmatory evidence, which again, Susan, to your point about how they do these things, they announced in the New England Journal essay. Lovely to read, but not the way you want to sort of promote changes in federal policy. And in this case, there was no need for it. Honestly, Commissioner McCary claimed that he was shifting the baseline from two adequate and well-controlled clinical trials as the basis of evidence for demonstrating the effectiveness of a new drug to a single trial. Well, that was done in 1997. We put that into statute a long time ago with the agency's concurrence and advice. And I think this notion that now it's suddenly going to be only one trial. If you look anywhere in the internets, in the interwebs, or elsewhere for some sort of codification, Wayne, of that standard, you're not going to find it. It's literally the New England Journal essay. So if I'm a sponsor, I would be very loath to come to the agency and say, hold up a reprint of a journal essay and say, this is the legal basis for me claiming that one trial is enough for me to get a new drug application approved by you. that's really not the way to do this. So, unless there's a rulemaking or something else to follow through on that, I really don't think that it's not quite a nothing burger, but it's very, very close to it.
And devices, headlines, one or two headlines.
You know, I think this is extraordinary, the amount of things that did not happen in relation to medical devices. I think there have been very positive developments, and not least of which, as we were talking about leadership changes, Susan, the fact that Dr. Tarver is still in place is, I think, a great thing. Boy, and I only wish that had been the case for C. Dur and C. Burr. But Wayne, to your point, I think the fact that they were actually able to first memorialize the Madoff agreement on time, that's great. There was a huge shift, right, away from quality system regulations, the old 21 CFR Part 820, to a new regime, the Quality Management System Regulation, QMSR. It's not just a change in acronym. It is actually a modernization and a convergence, a global convergence towards standards under ISO and under what we've promulgated. That is a really good and important change, and it happened kind of quietly. And the other part of it I'd say was the regulation of AI, right? That is increasingly part of many submissions, PMAs, de novo 510Ks, reflected in the changes in technology. It's a bit of a rough road, I think, as the agency struggles to find out what is or not regulable. But I do think that they have shown some agility, some nimbleness, some flexibility. And I think given how rapid changes have been in the area and the fields, that has been a positive development as well for medical devices under CDRH.
I'd be remiss if we didn't cover cosmetics, because we do cover cosmetics in our podcast. If it's okay, let me cover. Let me just make a few comments, and that is we had the beginning of the implementation of MOCRA, Modernization Act. They appear to be going fairly slowly. They missed a bunch of deadlines in terms of getting things out. I just don't have a sense that cosmetics is that big an issue for this administration. Susan, you were once responsible for that. And just let me ask your perspective on what kind of priority do cosmetics need within the agency. Let me just predicate that by that. CIFSAN used to cover cosmetics, so Susan, when she was head of CIFSAN, of course, was also responsible for the cosmetics program.
Yeah, and I would say it is one of the most under-resourced programs at FDA, given the exposure and the financial ramifications of cosmetic use. We had some statistics on how many cosmetics a consumer uses every day, and it's 8 or so for men, 12 for women every single day. And so assuring that safety is important. Because the program has been so small, we focused in on the highest risk areas of cosmetics, and that was things like asbestos contamination of talc, other contaminants like benzene and others in cosmetic products. We are seeing some recalls continuing, and so I'm reassured to see that. There's one right now for contaminated, I think it was shampoo, a hair product. So those recalls are continuing, and I'm glad to see that. But they've gotten new authorities. They need resources to really recognize the vision of what a modern cosmetic regulatory framework could look like. And I think the industry wants that as well, because for U.S. to export cosmetics to other countries want to have assurances that the U.S. regulators are on top of cosmetic safety. So it's in everybody's best interest to do a robust regulatory job on cosmetics.
Let me go down a few other areas. Susan, infant formula, obviously been a controversial topic. What do you see going on there?
Well, Operation Stork Speed has been a priority of the administration. They announced it pretty early on. The focus was, again, more on chemical contaminants and nutritional ingredients in infant formulas, concerns about things like lead and arsenic. The FDA, to their credit, recently released a survey of powdered infant formula where they tested for a variety of contaminants, including PFAS, and the results were pretty reassuring. I think the big elephant in the room is not so much chemical food safety as it relates to infant formula as it is microbial food safety. And if I was doing Operation Stork Speed, I'd want microbial right at the top of my priority list, having lived through the Abbott recalls due to bacterial contamination of powdered infant formula. I think they've now seen that happen with not just one, but now two recalls of powdered infant formula for botulism. And this is a very serious illness where infants can die. And so FDA is very busy trying to figure out how that contamination occurred and what does the infant formula industry need to do to prevent botulism contamination. The EU has also had some recalls for contamination, a chemical byproduct of a bacteria in powdered infant formula. So I think that is the biggest threat is potential shortages. If we have contamination of one of the large manufacturers, we have a highly concentrated infant formula market. So I think that's really got to be a priority for the agency is to really address that issue. And against that, a few things that have recently happened that I will take note of is the one that has made a lot of news is that the Department of Justice was pursuing a criminal investigation against Abbott Labs. That was public information, but that has now been closed. And the Department of Justice and people in the administrations have said that they don't believe in regulation by prosecution. But knowing that company CEOs could be prosecuted and potentially face things like jail time for knowingly shipping contaminated food to consumers, that was a huge deterrent. And now the administration has basically eliminated that deterrent by saying they're no longer going to consider prosecution. So that's received a lot of attention, especially given the fact that we're having ongoing problems with infant formula.
Paul, one last question before we go to a break, and that has to do with the recent announcement by OMB that there will be a proposed new regulation that would have the effect of restricting, that might not even be a strong enough word, of making it so difficult to have direct-to-consumer advertising on television and radio. That's obviously a huge franchise. We're all inundated by those ads. What's your take on that? And do you think that in this environment with First Amendment being such a big issue, with the networks obviously having concern about their income, how do you see that playing out? Just by one more piece of information, they said that they would have the proposed regulation out by the end of the year. And then obviously they would have to go through a comment period and finalize it. So your take on that?
Yeah, the proposal is pretty brief. They're going to try to roll back one of the key changes that were made under Commissioner Kessler that fully enabled DTC television ads and other types of media ads for prescription drugs, and that would be eliminating the brief summary requirement, which is you can encapsulate and capture all the major risk and contraindication safety information basically in a very fast, very efficient format that is compatible with, say, a 30-second or a 1-minute TV spot. That is something that obviously has been very, very visible. It's been spoken to by Secretary Kennedy and by Commissioner McCary, then former Commissioner McCary. But as you said, Wayne, whether or not they promulgate this and then whether or not they can actually uphold that requirement or the change in requirements under judicial challenge are completely different questions. I mean, in some ways, the agency has been on its heels in relation to the regulation of commercial speech. And for them to find, I think, out of the blue, some sort of new, novel, and compelling argument to the courts that this is a reasonable restriction on speech, on commercial speech, that I think is a challenging prospect. I mean, it's a very popular one, but whether or not they can actually maintain that under challenge is a wholly other proposition.
And that will clearly evolve. And I have predicted it was going to wind up in litigation. Just to clarify one thing, you mentioned that it was issued under Dr. Kessler. It was issued after that guidance was issued after I was there. It was issued after Dr. Kessler left, because I don't think that David would have favored it. I don't think that he wanted more direct-to-consumer television advertising. We're going to take a quick break now, but we'll be right back with Susan Mayne and Paul Kim. And we're back. We're talking about the first half of the year. Susan, a few other food topics, lots of them. The states. I don't even have to say anything. Just opine upon what's going on with regard to the relationship between the FDA and the states and how you see that evolving.
Yeah, it's a very interesting time right now, kind of unprecedented in some ways. And what's happened is with the concern amongst consumers and others about food ingredients, chemical ingredients, and that includes things like synthetic dyes, but other ingredients as well. What we're seeing is because FDA has not taken regulatory action on these things, many of the states are introducing legislation to do so themselves. So we're seeing a whole plethora of state laws being passed. Many of them target school lunch programs, but some don't limit themselves to school lunch program. For example, in West Virginia, they passed a law that would ban all synthetic dyes in food coming into the state. So that has created enormous challenges. And as this has happened more and more across the US, what we're doing is creating essentially a patchwork of different ingredient laws around the country that would cause absolute chaos for the food industry, as they don't want to make different food products for different states in the United States. That could create all kinds of supply chain problems, that could create food inflationary costs. And so industry has gotten very activated. What we've now seen is both legislation potentially being considered on the Hill. One of the laws that we're seeing a lot of discussion around right now is called the FRESH Act. It's FDA Review and Evaluation of Safe, Healthy, and Affordable Foods Act. That would essentially be a preemption law that says that there's going to be one regulator of food and it's going to be the FDA. States will no longer have the ability to do that. That's extremely controversial. FDA has been sharing food safety with the states forever, and so this would be a big change. There's also issues under the Constitutional Interstate Commerce Clause that says Congress has granted the power to regulate trade among the states. And so if we surrender that to different states, that has legal ramifications as well. But at the same time, if we preempt the states but don't resource FDA to do that job of federal regulation of food ingredients, then we all lose. And so this is a very, very unique time as we face this issue. It's related to the GRAS rule, generally recognized as safe rule that I mentioned before, that has to do with FDA really looking at all of these ingredients, mandating, for example, that those ingredients are looked at by FDA, even if they have not been submitted to FDA in the past. That again is quite controversial. It's not clear that FDA even has the authority to mandate notification. So there is also legislation on that front. One particular one I'll mention is the Better Food Disclosure Act. That's federal legislation that would mandate food companies report all ingredients and chemical additives to the FDA. So essentially modifying the prior Food Additives Amendment language to mandate notification. So this relationship between the states and federal regulation on food ingredients is very, very hot right now. A lot of discussion around that, and that's an area that we really, really, really want to watch because it has so many ramifications for food regulation more broadly.
Paul, again, I'm going to ask very brief questions because all I've got to do is say a word or two. Rare diseases, rare diseases. Talk a little bit about rare diseases and what you see happening. We've been working together on rare diseases for a long, long time. What do you see going on there?
I think the two things that were positive developments were, one, the Rare Disease Innovation Hub that's supposed to be at the sort of the center point of the two review centers and Oncology Center of Excellence didn't disappear. They didn't get rid of it, so that was good. The second one is, of course, I think this promulgation of the plausible mechanism evidence framework, which needs to be shored up and placed firmly into codification of some kind, so that people can start citing it and using it and relying on it to develop their drug development programs and have dialogue with the agency about them. The thing that's missing, I think, really is having seen what happened with baby KJ and validating this approach. This is a bottom-up sort of a grassroots approach towards drug development. This is not a major biopharma, right, finding these molecules and these potential cures. Instead, it's really coming out of rare disease centers of excellence in the US. So what's missing, I think, Wayne, is really the federal support for these kinds of centers and for these academics. It may be on the regulatory side and expediting, and we'll talk a little bit about this, no doubt. Getting phase 1 trials done faster, getting them launched quicker, but also the material support, to sustain this collaborative enterprise, to enable access to manufacturing of small lots where there's no commercial incentive, right? Where there's no market really to speak of. And yet we're seeing some company formation, but that is really not the way that this is going to happen. It's going to happen really from ground up. And I think what's missing, Wayne, is a lot of the federal support that will give life to these regulatory proposals like plausible mechanism evidentiary framework and give life to public-private partnerships that can be run through the hub. So that's the missing part. And it's not clear whether that's going to be acted on by Congress as part of PDUFA 8. But, we've seen actively this sort of deterioration of funding, access, and opportunities at NIH, which is, cutting in exactly the wrong direction.
Let me ask you both the same question. And again, I only have to say one or two words: AI. Neither, I think, Susan, you mentioned AI very, very briefly, but certainly AI is now taking over the world. So I want to ask you, Susan, first. What do you see happening at the agency, and where are the best uses of AI within the human foods program and within the FDA generally?
One of the obvious ones is how can it help target the right products for inspection? What information can be brought in that we're not already bringing in? The foods program was doing some pilot work to see whether or not AI could increase the hit rate, the violation rate of products that are being sampled at our borders. That was an area that Janet Woodcock was very interested in when she was acting commissioner. Could that be rolled out across the agency? Also, just procedurally, are there ways that it can facilitate the work? I know some of the early introductions of ELSA were not very successful within the foods program. The staff found that it created too much rework for them and it wasn't adding efficiency, but that's how you learn. So I think they will find areas where AI can facilitate the work, but it's always going to need verification because we've all seen those problems of AI. So that's a general comment.
Paul, AI certainly being used in the drug and devices area quite aggressively.
Absolutely. And I think the story there is sort of an inside-outside one. The inside one is easy for us to think about, and it does go to these questions of resourcing and support and staffing at the agency, that you've raised, Susan, which is, we hear that under former Commissioner McCary that they've rolled out agentic advice, using, I think it was Claude, to help facilitate the regulatory activities and the review work. On the other hand, they're saying they're not training them on actual NDAs and BLAs because they're commercial, confidential, or trade secret, or otherwise protected. So the magic question is, if you're training it on something else, but then you're going to use it on actual NDAs and BLAs, isn't there sort of an inherent inconsistency there that we should be worried about? And there has been a fundamental lack of transparency about that. So I worry about that fundamental question, like, how are you doing this? And then as well as the mirror resourcing, that, of course, you need to enable the agency to have these tools. As you said, Wayne, they're being rolled out and utilized, and the use cases for these are just exploding exponentially. And on the outside, let's talk about this a little bit. The administration has been very sort of hands off, let 1,000 flowers bloom, until they don't, and they start shutting down, Anthropic for different reasons, and they worry about access to the most recent and most powerful models. And I think we need to be thinking about this in two ways. One, in terms of drug development, this is obviously showing validation now. We're seeing some very incredible, promising leads in drug development, molecules being identified, facilitating clinical trials, which is terrific. And we don't want to inhibit that. But then in terms of the use of AI as devices, I mean, there are potentialities and uses here, which there are no predicates, right? The whole framework really kind of shudders to a halt when you don't have a predicate for, say, a model that's able to predict disease progression, right? On the basis of X or Y, a film, or, an analyte. That's an extraordinary change and leap in capabilities. And, what we want to have is what I think has been happening, which is the agency being cautious, the agency not holding stuff back, but trying to find a middle ground, right? Trying to find an evidentiary base that is reasonable to ask, that would substantiate these extraordinary, right? These de novo claims, extraordinary claims of use, but not trapping developers and sponsors in a place where they have to run multi-year, extraordinarily large clinical trials to substantiate these claims. It's a very tough place, and I think we need we need, I think, congressional action so much as, public-private dialogue and partnerships, standard setting. How do we validate on the basis of evidence that's generated in clinical practice? These are things that aren't really done particularly well today. And we need to be very, very good about that. We need to be very agile because the demands on the regulatory structure are going to be extraordinary.
Susan, over the last year or year and a half, there's been a lot of angst about FDA, a lot of concern. Certainly, I'm sure that a lot of the people that you worked with and our friends lost their jobs or are no longer there. Just generally, from your own personal perspective, are you optimistic about the agency? How do you feel? What's your mood with regard to the agency?
I would say my mood is much better over the last 2 months, given the return to normalcy that we've seen. And what I think is going to be absolutely critical is whoever they nominate to be the next commissioner. If that commissioner operates under those principles of leading with science, giving deference to agency experts, and procedural regularity, I'm very optimistic. But if we see more of a return to abnormal procedures and lack of deference to agency expertise, I'm worried.
Paul, your mood.
Cautious optimism. I think, Susan, you are 100% right about sort of what the prospects are for positive and sustained return to normalcy, and it does start at the top. I will also say it's been good to see that for the PDUFA and the MDUFA negotiations, that the agreements were reached in a timely way. There are two cliffs, right? One is, of course, October 1st of next year, when the funding for user fees, we lose that authority. It has to be reauthorized. But the other cliff, in a way, is January 15th, which is when, by statute, these agreements need to be reported to Congress, and we get the whole ball rolling there. And I will be cautious about the reauthorizations, because if you look at the last reauthorization, you'll recall when in 2022, they had to bifurcate, they had to split the package. The user fee reauthorization happened on one side, and because of continuing and lingering debates over the FDA reforms, or what we call the package or the Christmas tree, that was passed subsequently in a consolidated appropriations bill. It concerns me because previously reauthorizations have happened in a single unitary legislative vehicle, and that may sound like just like inside baseball too much, but that is a testament, that is a quality indicator of whether Congress can do its job well. And in both cases, in the last two authorizations, we've had unified government. We've had a Republican administration in 2017 under President Trump's first term, and a Republican Congress. And then subsequently, we had President Biden with a Democratic Congress. So that's holding that sort of constant. We've seen more friction. We've seen more difficulties in Congress getting to yes and getting the job done. So I'm a little concerned for this next cycle, and hopeful that maybe there'll be change in November with the midterms, but that Congress will be able to actually stick the landing and do it in a timely way to keep the agency funded.
So final questions for both of you. Susan, what haven't we covered? What haven't we covered in the foods area?
Two things I'm really watching closely are related to ultra-processed food definitions and how that's going to impact the federal food supply. That's one piece of it, and front of pack labeling. So what we've heard coming from Secretary Kennedy and others is that ultra-processed food is poisoning the American diet, that our children are being poisoned. They have committed to define what ultra-processed food is. But interestingly, that's the rhetoric. The reality is that there is no proposed regulation to define ultra-processed food in the unified agenda, and it's not in the guidance agenda either. So what we are now hearing is there may simply be an announcement that would be used for ultra-processed food, potentially for research purposes only. Certainly, if you were going to ban ultra-processed foods from federal procurement, you'd need to have a regulatory definition, but we're not seeing steps taken to do that. We've also heard related to that is front-of-pack labeling. Red, yellow, green is what the Secretary has said. FDA did propose a rule for front-of-pack nutrition labeling. I don't know if they're going to finalize it as it was proposed. There certainly was nothing about colors in there because FDA's own consumer research indicated that was not the most effective model to use. And so where that heads, we'll see. On the unified agenda that was released this week, it says FOP, front of pack labeling, has a December 2026 final rule date, again, after the midterms. And I'm wondering if some of these dates coming after the midterms reflect some concerns that the rhetoric isn't actually matching the reality, and some of the MAHA consumers will not be feeling that all of their needs have been met with some of the proposals or final rules that will be coming.
Again, just to ask you, the veteran red, yellow, green, explain a little bit what we're likely to see if the final rule goes through.
Well, I think I'm only reflecting what the Secretary has indicated, but I think he's indicating that certain foods would have red, yellow, green, stop, pause, or green, go. But what those attributes would be based upon is not entirely clear. FDA proposed that it be based upon saturated fat, added sugar, and sodium. And if the levels are too high, there would be interpretive labeling saying high, medium, or low. FDA did not propose the use of colors for a variety of reasons, including their own consumer research. So we'll see what's coming with regard to final rules around front-of-pack nutrition labeling.
Paul, final word. What haven't we covered?
Two quick things. We talked about the positive nature of this plausible mechanism evidence framework, but what really has manifested normalcy has been the agency revisiting some of the drugs that had been blocked by Dr. Prasad and his unprecedented, whiplash expectations of new evidence, which had not been previously communicated to the sponsors. Two examples: Evalo, right, which is a drug which is on the basis of a single arm trial. That instead of being rejected, they're being revisited, and the door's been opened to them again. And then Replimune, RP1. They have an advisory committee meeting that's been scheduled for the end of this month. So they've come back from the dead, in some ways. And that, I think, is, again, proof positive of that return to normalcy, Susan, that you've been talking about. The other thing, very quickly, I'll also say, Wayne, is that the first stirrings of the legislative package of the wrapper, the Christmas tree around PDUFA, have begun. There's been one draft proposal from Congressman Auchincloss that really is very, very ambitious in talking about boosting point-of-care, clinically based clinical trials, really bringing this to bear to rapidly accelerate innovation. Some very interesting proposals to authorize the Rare Disease Innovation Hub that I mentioned, and to change and put into statute standards for how much evidence for a new drug should come from the U.S. And this is obviously very potent in relation to China right now. So that's an encouraging start, I think, to the legislative conversation that we're going to see over the next 18 months, leading into creating and reauthorizing PDUFA and MDUFA.
On that note, it's time to thank Susan Mayne, Paul Kim, being such great guests. We covered so much territory in this podcast. Great summary for the first half of the year. We'll do it again at the end of the year and see what happens. And hopefully there will be, I'll use the word stability, more stability at the agency moving forward than we've seen in recent times. I want to thank our podcast creator and executive producer, Michael Levin Epstein, our assistant producer, new father, Sam Hoffmeister. If any of our listeners want to find out more about the podcast, you visit our website, fdawatch.net, fdawatch.net, and that's how you subscribe. You go to fdawatch.net, you put your email address in there, you subscribe, and every time that we have a new episode, you will get an email. And we're trying to build up our subscriber list. We have so many downloads. We have 25,000 downloads so far since we started this podcast. And that really is, I am told, a good number. but we're looking for more. So please do subscribe, FDAWatch.net. As we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch. This is Wayne Pines.